Now, Nathan is deceptively smart and knowledgeable. He's a publisher and a computer expert. He's fluent in Old, Middle, and Modern English. He's going to tell us a story, which is quite funny, at least if you lived in 1490, about how English was moving in, or elements of English were coming in from the south, from France, and in the north of England from the Norse people, and how they didn't necessarily, the people of the south of England didn't necessarily understand the people of the north. And the story is about the uneven spread of words in the English language, and it's called United and Divided by a Common Language. Take it away, Nathan.
Thank you, David. Anyone worried by the description, trust me, it's a good, it's a funny story. I love studying languages and how they change. English has evolved for its entire history, and as a writer, I need to be especially familiar with how it's changed since I was born and over the last century, especially because sometimes I write very young characters and characters of different ages and time periods. One benefit of working online is that my kid and my friends' kids like to include me when they're playing video games or watching new streaming shows, which is an honor. Although I did have to train them that just because I'm online doesn't mean I'm free. It helped to gather them all into a single Discord server so they could entertain each other instead of constantly interrupting me because they saw my online status. Um, and so I kept an eye on them, but not only was I soon happy to see that they mostly got along and they learned to usually learn to settle their own differences, but I also that gave me a front row seat to all the new and latest slang words they would use. And for me as a writer, this was a really special thing. Now, when I was a kid, it seemed like we'd have a new word every year or so. Let me inform you now that Gen Z and Gen Alpha seem to have an entirely new and exciting word about every 4 months, which is a lot to try and keep up with. I give it about 2 weeks to figure out what on earth they're talking about or saying. And if I don't get it by then, I just ask them and they happily teach this Gen Xer what they're talking about. So based, cap, no cap, sheesh, riz, sometimes even whole songs they would sing together if one of them happened to say the right cue word or phrase. It's getting easier now that they're older, but mainly I just try to keep up. And by the way, Carol, if you thought Xavier's joke was a little risque, trust
Huh?
me, most of the jokes that the kids tell each other on that Discord server would curl Xavier's hair. One week on that 1 week on the Discord server, and he looked like an Airedale. So one day on the server, for example, someone asked if anyone wanted to join him in a game of Minecraft, and another said she would, and he said bet, 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 which I thought might be short for like, well, I'll bet I'll see you there soon, but that wasn't quite right. And a few days later, someone did something that annoyed another one, who told him to stop, and he answered bet, which seemed to mean agreement. And a day later, one bragged that he'd won an online match in a game and posted the picture of the scoreboard. And someone else said bet, which seemed to be congratulations. And still a week later, I was going to watch a streaming show, and did anyone want to join me in about an hour? And a couple of them said bet, which clearly meant they were happy and excited and ready to join. Bet can actually mean one of several kinds of approval or acceptance, depending on how you use it. Now, just like all the other terms I mentioned, like based, for example, bet's an existing older term from what we now call African American Vernacular English. And while I'd never heard it before, suddenly, about a year ago, half a dozen white and Latino kids spread across the entire United States seemed to learn it at the exact same moment. And in a matter of like 2 weeks, they'd settled into a handful of entirely context-based meanings. It was remarkable overnight. So I try and keep up, and while I can't really claim that I use any of these new terms fluently, um, it is the case that what I do enjoy is the fatherly pastime of learning their favorite slang and then subtly misusing it in a way that is technically right, but not actually correct, which drives them up the wall. Although I think they've finally caught on to me. And so, and so, so we get along, and all the time we're always really speaking English with each other. But every now and again, for a week or two until I catch on, we are clearly speaking different kinds of English. And so while that can sometimes be annoying, I always like to keep in mind that this has been happening for as long as language has existed. And so I'm going to share my favorite example of this. This is a thing I kind of find funny linguistically. In 1476, a man named William Caxton brought the first mechanical printing press to England and started translating classical works and printing them in English for the first time. He wasn't very good at translation, all things considered, but these were the first times that any of these works were actually available in English and available far and wide. At that time, English dialects were so different from each other that it could be very, very difficult for one person to understand someone from another part of the country. Travel back then was really rare, so new words and changes could take decades to spread. And printed books would actually be the reason English became standardized, but that would take about 200 years, and for the next 10 or 15 years, William Caxton would get complaints that his books used too many strange and obscure words that the readers couldn't read. So in 1490, when Caxton published the Aeneid, he wrote in the preface that he understood the complaints and worked very hard in this book to use very plain and common words instead of fancy ones. And because English was so different everywhere, he asked his readers to sort of meet him halfway. And by way of example, he told a story about how much English had changed even in the 7 years since he had been born. So the story is actually fascinating because it's right in the middle of a massive change in English, from the German-sounding Old English to the end of the French-influenced Middle English that Chaucer had been writing in 100 years before. And it was just about to change all the sense of the language so that another 100 years in the future, Shakespeare's early modern English would still be understandable to us today, but his accent would be very, very strange. For Caxton, his English would sound like a completely different language. Those vowels hasn't changed yet. So I'm going to tell you Caxton's story about eggs. I translated it into modern English, and once I'm done, I'll retell it in its original form. All you have to know before I start is that we used to make plurals by adding an en, like the word ox and oxen. And the word for egg was actually, the native English word was I, and plural was eyren. The word egg was actually from Old Norse and hadn't made its way from the north of England to the south, where the story takes place. And even the s we add for plural was from Norse, and so that spread slowly. And this story takes place right as that's kind of making its way, but hadn't reached Kent yet. So with that bit of preparation, you're ready to hear a story from 1490 that isn't really about eggs. So William Caxton wrote, "Certainly, our language now used varies far from that which was used and spoken when I was born. Insomuch that in my days it happened that certain merchants were in a ship on the River Thames in order to sell over the sea into Zealand in the Netherlands, and for lack of wind they were delayed in Foreland in Kent, and went to land to eat. And one of them, named Sheffield, a mercer, came into our one house and asked for food.
Frozen
And
raven. Oh, okay.
yeah, and specially, he asked after eggs. And the good woman answered that she could speak no French. And the merchant was angry before he also could speak no French, but he wanted to have eggs, and she did not understand him. And at last, another said he would have eyren. And then the good woman said that she understood him well. Lo, what should a person in these days now write, eggs or eyren? Certainly, it is hard to please every person because of the diversity and change of language. So now let me transport you back 530 years to the story as it would have been told at this very dawn of early modern English. You'll be surprised how different it sounds and how much you can still understand. So Caxton wrote, "Uncertainly our language now used vareth fair from that which was used and spoken when I was born, in so much that in me days happened that certain merchants bore sheep and hams for to have sailed over the sea to Zealand, and for lack of wind they tarried at followed and went to land for to refresh them. And one of them, named Sheffield, a mercer, came into a house and asked if her mate, and specially he asked after eggys. And the good wife answered that she could speak no French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French, but would have had eggys, and she understood him not. And then at last another said that he would have eyren. Then the good wife said that she understood him well. Lo, what should a man in these days now read? Eggys or eyren? Certainly it is hard to please every man because of diversity and challenge of language. So the next time you hear kids speaking, and you understand every single word, but they don't make any sense in that particular order, just laugh and remember that for as long as language has existed, it's been changing and evolving, usually in interesting and fun ways, even if you're sometimes left behind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Oh,
It's always wonderful to hear you speak in English that we don't understand. Yes. So Nathan also translates from German into English. He's a very versatile character. Now, let us move on to our next speaker, Graham Lance Richardson's. Graham is a world traveler. He's over 80 years old. He's been to a lot of places. And he tells us stories in a lovely, unassuming